Culture is everything. It's it's how people are engaged with each other and how they perform and how they collaborate that really determines productivity, it determines profits, it determines satisfaction with the job, determines fulfillment, it determines how much or how little corruption there is in the company, it determines turnover and sick days. Culture is massive. The idea of culture architecture is that culture can be built consciously, deliberately, and strategically from the heart in good ways, but it can be built on purpose rather than just kind of falling in by default, which is really a very foolish way to build culture, because if it falls in by default, then people will build culture at the level of their self-development limitations despite their highest intentions. The days of leaders leading from that old style framework of do as I say and not as I am, those days are over, long over. And so one piece has to do with what we role model. The other has to do with procedures that we have in place, because culture is not some kind of abstract, nice idea, good intention, true but not useful concept. Culture at the nitty-gritty level is standardized procedures for how we collaborate with each other. If you think about architecture from the point of view of building, a home or an office building, you don't start by building the framing for the building. You start with an architectural plan. Well, it's the same thing with culture architecture. We have to be strategic. We need to start with our own clarity about what we want our business to be when it's all grown up, including not just profits, but people and social responsibility. In the corporate social responsibility movement, it's called the triple bottom line: profit, people, planet. What kind of atmosphere in our company would thrill us and the people we want working with us and staying with us to show up for and produce at high levels day in and day out, so that we have a great time being profitable rather than only being profitable? We have a great time doing it. What do we want our atmosphere to be in our company? That's going to make working there a joy for us and for the people that we hire? This starts with our values, our cultural values, our personal values, integrity, things along those lines. And that forms kind of guiding principles for building a culture. And then at the implementation end, there are lots of pieces to put into place. How do we select the right people to come into our culture? How do we acculturate them? In other words, how do we integrate them into our culture? How do we keep our culture growing and our people growing in ways that enable collaboration to really produce results? How do we do accountability procedures so that they're not about punishment and coercion, but really about growth? It's easier to develop good habits from the get-go than to install bad habits and then have to change them. There are cultures that are so dysfunctional that they suck the life energy out of their people. And anyone who thinks that a business that has people too busy to attend to culture and self-development is going to be a profitable business over the long run, it has their head where the sun don't shine. Managing culture is like herding cats. That's a losing proposition. But facilitating, elevating, and holding accountable, that can be done. And that's what should be done instead of managing culture. In contrast to what I'm referring to as manage, which is an attempt to control, facilitation means that the people who are in leadership and management roles know how to facilitate the elevation of best practices, who know how to facilitate the repair of collaboration breakdowns, who know how to conduct performance reviews in ways that are growth oriented rather than punishment and coercion oriented, so that people dread their performance reviews rather than look forward to them. Elevating culture means building a learning culture, building a culture that is constantly striving to enhance collaboration and enhance productivity and enhance engagement. And accountability is simply um, a culture in which people are taking responsibility for the impacts that the choices they make about whether or not they follow through on their commitments have on the people in the company that they've made commitments to. Everybody is responsible for culture, but the C-suite is responsible for overseeing it and for setting the right tone. The intersection or the integration of leader development and culture development is the best investment a company can make. If they're doing leader development separate from culture development, their investment is inefficient. Their time, effort, and money investment is inefficient. And so it comes back down to teachability. Is the company willing to become teachable? Is the C-suite willing to become teachable? Is the board willing to direct the CEO to build a healthy culture? Even big companies can change if there is the will, the willingness, and the teachability on the part of the executives. Google, a number of years ago, was struggling with team performance. They would assemble work teams for various projects based on the criteria they thought they should be using for assembling teams, meaning the criteria they were using were about making sure they had the right blend of areas of technical expertise and competence on the work team to get that particular project that the work team was being created to accomplish done. And they weren't satisfied with the productivity that was happening with them using the formula for assembling teams that they were using. So they initiated a project called Project Aristotle. And Project Aristotle analyzed somewhere in the vicinity of 15,000 variables and interactions in looking for what the magic formula was for that differentiated productive, effective, harmonious teams from dysfunctional teams. When Google implemented the results that they found in how they constructed work teams, the culture upshifted. Just because unemployment levels are at record lows right now, that doesn't mean that we don't have a pool of people to select from. We're not necessarily looking to hire people who are unemployed. We may primarily be looking for people who are unhappily employed. And what we're needing to do is vet for two primary things when it comes to culture and when it comes to individual performance, individual engagement. And those two things are teachability and self-responsibility. So assuming that you have teachable and self-responsible people, you will have a learning culture that will value upgrading the culture rather than resist upgrading the culture. It's the unteachable and the non-self-responsible that don't want to make a culture into a healthy culture. Any company that keeps employees or personnel or executives or managers in their jobs who are not highly teachable and highly self-responsible is an insane company. Companies have to be willing to release the unteachable and the non-self-responsible. The technical knowledge side of a job is the smaller percentage of what it takes for someone to be a high performer. Of course, the knowledge is necessary, but knowledge is learnable. And so, frankly, are the soft skills. They're learnable too when there is teachability and self-responsibility. The marketplace is changing. The technology is changing. Procedures are changing. Products are changing. an incredibly breathtaking speed. It is what used to be called the hard skills that are actually transient skills. The durable skills are the soft skills. So any company that doesn't understand that and thinks of soft skills as second-class citizens is frankly asking for big trouble in terms of its sustainability. Millennials are much more purpose-driven than boomers were taught to be. Boomers were taught to sacrifice their sense of values and integrity and purpose in order to climb the corporate ladder, in order to achieve the 1950s delusion of the American dream. Well, millennials don't buy into that delusion of an American dream. They're actually more aligned with the original American dream. And so they need to experience meaning in their job, and they need to be working for a company that is doing good for its customers and good for the world. If they aren't, they won't be engaged. What unemployment levels don't take into account is the level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction that employed people have where they work. And there are an awful lot of unsatisfied employed people. And a lot of that dissatisfaction is because these people are working in companies where the culture, frankly, is dysfunctional. What I like to do is is to invite people in a very respectful way to ask in a very respectful way something that's going to throw the interviewer way off track. And there are two things that I recommend that they ask. The first is they ask the interviewer to tell them their company's relationship to the triple bottom line. And if the interviewer goes, "What? Huh? What's the triple bottom line?" to be prepared to say in a very cordial and collaborative and non-judgmental way, well, the triple bottom line is where a company measures success by virtue of how it is profitable, how it handles its people, and how it is socially responsible, how it respects the planet. So what is your company's relationship to profit, people, and planet, and the integration of those things? If the interviewer can't give you a cogent answer and you are a socially responsible person or you're a millennial, run, Toto, run, because that's not going to be a culture that you like. The second question that I recommend asking is asking the interviewer how collaboration breakdowns are turned into growth-oriented and team-building opportunities in that company. And again, if the interviewer can't provide a cogent answer to that, run, Toto, run, because that company doesn't have a handle on conflict resolution and is therefore almost certain to be a dysfunctional company that the prospective employee is going to end up being unhappy in. So there are certain companies that celebrate when someone gets a new opportunity that lets them keep growing in their career and as a person and as a leader and things along those lines. There are other companies, much more typically, where turnover is a function of job dissatisfaction, dysfunctional culture, dysfunctional leadership. People want out, or they've simply given up, they're not performing and they're getting fired. So what we have to always look at is, why is the turnover happening? If the turnover is happening because people are growing and emerging into capabilities where they can fill roles beyond the role that they're currently filling, and that role isn't available in their own company, that is actually inspiring to people in a company. If the reason for turnover is leader dysfunction or culture dysfunction, then the leadership and the culture climate needs to be upgraded. If you have two parents, both parents have children, the analogy being you have two owners or two companies and both companies have employees, then if these two people fall in love, in other words, if two businesses want to merge, or if one company wants to acquire another company, one of the questions is, uh, is this a functional family, or am I going to be marrying into a dysfunctional family? That's part of the culture piece, where you have to have culture in place and operating really well before you open up your company to being acquired. It's got to be a functional culture in the first place. And you want to have a merger situation or an acquisition situation where you're blending two functional, healthy families, rather than one functional and one dysfunctional family, or two, God forbid, dysfunctional families. So these are things that can be gauged and vetted beforehand, before an acquirer even decides to purchase a business. These things need to be vetted out, and the blending of families happens either by default, which is messy, or by design, which can be really enlivening and love building in a blended family. Same is true in a business. When a company is going to be sold and the personnel get wind of that, their first concern, rightly so, is, am I going to have a job after the sale? If the culture is built in such a way that the people are indispensable, that the people are the secret and the culture is the secret to the company's success, then the owners can vet potential buyers for culture fit, for making sure that a buyer is not going to be a vulture buyer who comes in and guts the company, destroys the founder's vision, and destroys the culture and lets people go. But where the buyer is someone who has bought the company not only because it's profitable, but because the buyer loves the way the company works, what they stand for, and how they operate. And yes, they're going to put their leadership stamp on the company once they have acquired it, but they are going to want to keep the culture strong because they realize the profitability is dependent on the culture that already exists.